December 7th, 1941. A date that would change everything. But this isn't the story you've heard before. This isn't about the battles fought on distant shores or the generals who commanded armies. This is about a different kind of warrior. One who fought with a rivet gun instead of a rifle. One who wore coveralls instead of combat fatigues. Her name was Rose, and Norma, and Betty. She was millions of women pouring into factories across America, answering a call that would transform not just the war, but themselves. Before the war, most of these women had never held a wrench. They'd never welded steel or operated a drill press. Society told them their place was in the home. But when their country needed them most, they proved society dead wrong. (1941). America stands on the brink. The attack on Pearl Harbor has thrust the nation into a global conflict, and suddenly the math doesn't add up. Millions of men are shipping out to fight overseas, but who's going to build the planes they'll fly, the ships they'll sail, the tanks they'll drive? The answer would come from an unexpected source. The government launched the largest recruitment campaign aimed at women in American history. The message was clear. Your country needs you, not to send care packages or roll bandages, to build the weapons of war itself. And they came, by the thousands, then the hundreds of thousands, then millions. Housewives, secretaries, teachers, store clerks, women who'd never imagined themselves in industrial work. Some came out of patriotism, others came for the wages, better than they'd ever earned before. Most came for both. Meet Helen Studer, 23 years old, married, working as a waitress in a diner in Long Beach, California. Her husband James shipped out with the Navy 3 weeks after Pearl Harbor. Helen's wages at the diner, about $14 a week. When Douglas Aircraft put up a sign saying they'd pay $40 a week, no experience necessary, Helen didn't think twice. She walked through those factory gates on a Monday morning in March 1942, and her life would never be the same.
I was scared to death. All those machines, all that noise. I thought, what have I gotten myself into? But then I looked around and saw all these other women just as scared as me, and I thought, if they can do this, so can I.
Helen wasn't alone. By 1943, women would make up more than a third of the workforce in aircraft manufacturing. In some munitions plants, they were 80% of all workers. They called them by many names. Rosie the Riveter became the icon, based on real women like Roswell Monroe, who actually did work as a riveter building B-29 bombers. But there were also Winnie the Welder, Wendy the Wire Wrapper, Sally the Shipfitter. Each nickname represented thousands of real women doing jobs that society had insisted they couldn't do. The learning curve was steep. Most of these women had never operated machinery more complex than a sewing machine. Now they were being asked to master industrial equipment, to read technical blueprints, to work with precision measured in thousandths of an inch. The factories set up training programs, sometimes just a few days or weeks long. Women learned to use welding torches that burned at thousands of degrees. They learned to operate massive hydraulic presses. They learned to buck rivets, one woman on each side of an aluminum panel, working in perfect rhythm. The work was grueling. Shifts ran 10, 12, sometimes 14 hours. The factory floors were loud enough to damage hearing. In summer, the metal buildings became ovens. In winter, they were freezers. The work was dangerous. One mistake could mean crushed fingers, burned skin, or worse. But something remarkable was happening. These women weren't just learning, they were excelling. At the Boeing plant in Seattle, women made up the majority of workers building B-17 flying fortresses. At Ford's Willow Run factory, women helped produce a B-24 Liberator bomber every single hour.
At first, the men didn't want us there. They said we couldn't handle it. that we'd slow down production. Within 6 months, we were outperforming them. Our reject rate was lower. Our attendance was better. We proved we could do anything they could do.
The statistics backed this up. Studies showed that women workers in many factories had lower rates of absenteeism than men. Their work was precise. Smaller hands proved advantageous for detailed assembly work. And they learned fast. Consider the story of Sybil Lewis, an African-American woman from Oklahoma who moved to Los Angeles to work in the aircraft industry. She faced double discrimination, as a woman and as a black person in a segregated society. But she persevered, becoming one of the first black women riveters at Lockheed Aircraft. The war opened doors that had been locked for generations. Black women, Mexican-American women, Asian-American women, they all joined the workforce in unprecedented numbers. The factories weren't paradise. Discrimination and segregation persisted. But for many women of color, these jobs represented economic opportunities they'd never had before. Maria Martinez left her job picking vegetables in California's Central Valley to work at a shipyard in Richmond. She'd never seen the ocean before. Now, she was helping build the ships that sailed on it. Her wages tripled overnight. But the challenges extended beyond the factory floor. These women weren't just workers. Many were mothers who would watch their children while they worked 12-hour shifts. The government, recognizing the crisis, helped establish childcare centers at major defense plants. The Kaiser shipyards in Oregon operated 2 of the most advanced childcare facilities in the country, serving over 1,000 children. They were open 24 hours, matching the factory's round-the-clock operations. These centers represented something revolutionary. The idea that women could be both mothers and workers, and that society had a responsibility to support both roles. It was an experiment that would largely end with the war, but the seed had been planted. But let's be honest about something the propaganda posters never showed. This wasn't easy. These women were working physically demanding jobs, often coming home to second shifts, cooking, cleaning, caring for families. The government might have called it patriotic duty, but that didn't make the exhaustion any less real. And while they were doing the same work as men, sometimes better work, they weren't getting the same pay. On average, women earned about 60% of what male workers made for identical jobs. The justification: that women were only temporary workers, that they didn't need to support families, that they'd go back home after the war.
It made me angry. I'd look at my paycheck and then look at what the man next to me was making, and I'd think, what's the difference? We're building the same plane. But if you complain too much, you'd be branded as unpatriotic. It was this trap, see? They needed us, but they didn't want to treat us as equals.
The workplace itself could be hostile. Sexual harassment was rampant, though no one called it that at the time. Some supervisors demanded sexual favors in exchange for better assignments or job security. Women who refused risked being fired. Women who reported it were often told they were making trouble. There was also the constant pressure of judgment. Women who worked in factories were sometimes called loose or unfeminine. They were caught in an impossible contradiction, told their country needed them, but also told they were abandoning their proper roles. And then there was the danger. The factories were hazardous environments. Women lost fingers in presses. They were burned by welding torches. They inhaled toxic fumes. Some lost their lives. In September 1943, an explosion at the Elkton Ordnance Plant in Maryland killed 15 women workers. They were loading shells with explosives, delicate, dangerous work. When something went wrong, there was no time to escape. Their names: Helen Dent, Betty Moser, Anna Sarrow, Josephine Presbury, Mamie Durham. They gave their lives for the war effort, just as surely as any soldier. But they would never receive military honors. Most Americans have never heard their names. These women were casualties of war. But because they died in factories rather than on battlefields, their sacrifice was often forgotten. They deserved better. They deserved to be remembered as the heroes they were. Despite everything, the discrimination, the exhaustion, the danger, these women got the job done, and the numbers speak for themselves. During World War II, American factories produced nearly 300,000 aircraft, 86,000 tanks, 12 million rifles and carbines, 64,000 landing craft, hundreds of thousands of trucks, jeeps, and artillery pieces. The sheer scale of production was unprecedented in human history, and women built it. All of it. Not alone, of course. But they were essential. Without them, the production miracle that won the war simply wouldn't have happened. General Eisenhower himself said that American production capacity was the decisive factor in defeating the Axis powers, but the impact went far beyond the battlefield. These women had proven something society had long denied, that they were capable of anything. They'd operated complex machinery. They'd managed teams. They'd solved technical problems. They'd done it all while dealing with discrimination and balancing family responsibilities.
I learned I could do things I never imagined. I learned I was strong, not just physically, but mentally. I could figure things out. I could stand up for myself. That changed me. You can't unlearn that about yourself.
For many women, especially women of color, the war years represented a taste of economic independence they'd never experienced before. Black women who'd worked as domestic servants for a few dollars a week were now earning real wages. They could save money, buy homes, send their children to college. The social impact was profound, too. Women who'd never left their hometowns traveled to new cities for factory work. They lived independently or in boarding houses with other women. They made friends across class and sometimes racial lines. They discovered they didn't need men to take care of them. Take Ruth Wilson, who left her small town in Georgia to work at a bomber plant in Texas. She'd never been more than 50 miles from home. She'd never had her own bank account. She'd never voted, couldn't even read, before the factory literacy program taught her. By the end of the war, Ruth was a lead assembler, supervising 20 workers. She'd saved $3,000, more money than her family had ever had. She could read newspapers. She registered to vote. When she returned to Georgia, she wasn't the same woman who'd left. August 1945. The war ends, and America faces a question. What happens now? For the women who'd powered the war effort, the answer was swift and brutal. They were laid off by the millions. The government launched new campaigns, not calling women to work, but urging them to go home, to make way for the returning soldiers, to embrace their proper roles as wives and mothers. Many women had no choice. They needed the jobs, but the jobs disappeared. The childcare centers closed, the wages vanished. Women who'd been celebrated as patriots were now told they'd been filling in temporarily, that their real value was in the home.
They used us. That's what it felt like. When they needed us, we were heroes. The minute the war ended, we were in the way. I wanted to keep working. I liked what I did. I was good at it. But they made it clear that job was for a man now.
The post-war years saw a massive push back to traditional gender roles. The 1950s would become synonymous with suburban domesticity, with women defined primarily as homemakers and mothers. On the surface, it seemed like the war years had been an aberration, a temporary disruption of the natural order. But something had changed. It couldn't be unchanged. The women who'd worked in the factories didn't forget, and they passed on what they'd learned to their daughters. When Betty Friedan wrote The Feminine Mystique in 1963, sparking the modern women's movement, many of those early activists were the daughters of factory workers. They'd grown up hearing stories of what their mothers had accomplished, of the strength they'd discovered, of the injustice they'd faced. The civil rights movement, the women's liberation movement, the fight for equal pay. All of these drew inspiration and momentum from what had happened during the war. The factory queens had proven it was possible. Now their daughters would finish what they'd started. Today, women work in every field imaginable. They're engineers and electricians. They're construction workers and pilots. They're CEOs and scientists. None of this would have been possible without the women who picked up rivet guns and welding torches in 1942. The factory queens. Hence, they weren't perfect. They lived in imperfect times, navigating impossible contradictions. They faced discrimination, exhaustion, and danger. Many of them never received the recognition they deserved, but they changed the world. They proved that women could do anything. They helped win a war. They helped build the most powerful industrial economy in history, and they planted seeds of change that would blossom in the decades to come. Rose and Norma and Betty and Helen and Sybil and Maria and Ruth and millions more whose names we'll never know. They weren't just building planes and ships and tanks. They were building a future where their daughters wouldn't have to fight so hard to be seen as equals. That future is still being built. The work isn't finished. But every woman who picks up a tool, who enters a trade, who demands equal pay, who refuses to be told what she can't do, she's carrying on the legacy of the factory queens. This is their story, and it's far from over.